She didn't even look at him when she said it. Victoria Sterling stood at the head of that gleaming conference table. 43rd floor, floor-to-ceiling glass, a skyline that cost more to look at than most people earned in a year. And she pointed toward the door like she was shooing away something that had wandered in from the street. "Leave," she said, her voice carrying the particular coldness of someone who had never once questioned whether she had the right. "Before you embarrass yourself. And me." Caleb Rowan didn't move for exactly 2 seconds, long enough for everyone in that room to feel it. Then he picked up his folder, buttoned his jacket, and walked out. The contract was gone 11 minutes later. Well, if you've ever watched someone get dismissed like they were nothing, like their voice didn't matter, like their warning didn't count, then you already know how this story feels. Subscribe to our channel and hit that like button so you never miss what happens next. Drop your city and country in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story has traveled, because what happens to Caleb Rowan in the next few hours is going to change everything you think you know about power, pride, and who actually runs the room. The morning had started the way most bad days do, quietly, without warning, with the particular ordinariness that makes disaster so hard to see coming. Caleb Rowan arrived at Sterling Dynamics headquarters at 7:43, which was earlier than most of his colleagues and later than he usually preferred. He took the elevator to the 14th floor, not the executive suites on 38, not the client hospitality floors, just 14, where the risk analysis team sat in a cluster of practical cubicles with decent monitors and bad coffee and a view of the parking garage. He set down his messenger bag, poured himself a cup from the communal pot without checking whether it was fresh, and opened the contract file he'd been working through for the past 11 days. He'd flagged it twice through internal channels. Once to his direct supervisor, Marcus Webb, who told him the legal team had reviewed everything and he should trust the process. Once to the compliance intake system, which generated an automated response acknowledging receipt and assigning a ticket number that, as far as Caleb could tell, had never been opened by a human being. The contract was with Ardent Consolidated, a logistics and supply chain firm that had spent the better part of 3 years trying to break into managed infrastructure partnerships. Sterling Dynamics provided that infrastructure: data management systems, financial oversight platforms, compliance architecture for mid to large enterprise clients. The deal on the table was worth $480 million over 6 years, structured in 3 tranches, and it had been publicly announced 2 weeks ago with a press release that used the words transformative, landmark, and historic in the first 2 paragraphs. What the press release did not mention, what the press release could not have mentioned, because the people who wrote it either hadn't read Section 14C of the amended annex or had chosen not to, was a liability clause buried in the contract's 3rd addendum that effectively gave Ardent Consolidated the right to terminate the agreement with cause and pursue damages up to 40% of projected revenue if Sterling's compliance systems failed to meet a set of performance benchmarks that, upon close reading, were almost certainly impossible to guarantee. Caleb had spent 11 days reading that clause from every angle he could think of. He'd run 3 different scenario models. He'd cross-referenced the benchmark language against industry standards. He'd looked at Ardent's legal history, 2 prior contract disputes with vendors, both settled, both involving language similar to what appeared in Section 14C. This wasn't a technicality. This was a trap door. He looked at the time on his screen. 8:17. The signing ceremony was scheduled for 11. He picked up his phone. Marcus Webb didn't answer. Caleb left a message, calm, specific, 3 sentences. The clause, the risk, the request for an urgent meeting before 11. He sent a follow-up email with the relevant pages attached and the specific benchmark language highlighted in yellow. At 9:04, Marcus texted back, "Legal cleared it. We're good. Don't spin yourself up." Caleb stared at that message for a moment. He thought about his son, Dylan, who was 9 years old and currently at school 3 miles away, and who had asked that morning, while eating cereal with his face half asleep, whether his dad's important meeting today was going to go okay. "Should be fine," Caleb had told him. He picked up his bag, took the contract file, and went upstairs. The 38th floor was a different country. Caleb had been up there twice in 4 years, once for an all-company meeting that used the large event space, once to drop off physical documentation that couldn't be transmitted electronically. He wasn't unfamiliar with corporate executive spaces. He'd worked in them earlier in his career, before he made the deliberate choice to step back. But there was always that particular atmospheric shift when you moved from the working floors to the executive floors. The air felt more controlled, the surfaces more reflective, the silence more curated. The assistant at the front desk looked at him with the professional blankness of someone deciding whether to escalate. "I need to speak with someone from the CEO's office," Caleb said. "It's time sensitive. It's about the Ardent signing." "Do you have an appointment?" "No, that's why I said time sensitive. She made a call." Caleb stood and waited. Through the glass walls of the corner conference room, he could see setup underway, catering staff arranging a table, someone adjusting the positioning of branded displays, a photographer testing light angles. The signing ceremony was going to be an event. Of course it was. $480 million warranted flowers and cameras. A man came out to meet him, mid-30s, trim suit, the look of someone whose job was to intercept things before they became problems. His name tag said R. Whitfield, Executive Operations. "You're from Risk Analysis?" Whitfield said, not unkindly, but with the specific register of someone who had already categorized this visit. "Caleb Rowan. I've been the lead analyst on the Ardent contract review. I've identified a liability clause that I believe needs to be addressed before the signing. I've escalated through internal channels and haven't gotten traction. I'm here because the signing is in under 2 hours, and this is the kind of thing that—" "Let me stop you," Whitfield said. "Legal has signed off on this contract. The CEO has personally reviewed the summary documents. We're 3 hours out from one of the company's most significant signings. I appreciate your diligence, but I'm not questioning legal's review. I'm questioning whether they read Section 14C of the third addendum the way I'm reading it, because the benchmark language in that section is—" "Mr. Rowan." Whitfield's tone shifted slightly. "Patience with a ceiling. I'll take your name and have someone from legal reach out to you this afternoon." "This afternoon," Caleb said. "Yes." Caleb looked at him. He thought about Dylan eating cereal. He thought about the 43 employees in the Ardent implementation team who had already been briefed on project commencement. He thought about what 40% of projected revenue looked like on a loss statement. "Okay," he said. "I'll put it in writing." He went back downstairs and wrote a 3-page memo. Specific, documented, professionally measured. He sent it to Marcus Webb, to the compliance intake system, and to the general legal inbox, and he CC'd his own personal email address because something in his gut told him to keep a copy somewhere that wasn't on Sterling's servers. Then he went to the signing ceremony because Marcus had forwarded him the all-staff invitation that morning and told him attendance was expected from senior analysts, and Caleb was, technically, a senior analyst, regardless of how the executive floor had treated him 20 minutes ago. The ceremony room held approximately 60 people by the time Caleb arrived. Sterling Dynamics executives, legal representatives, communication staff, a handful of photographers and a videographer, and 3 people from Ardent Consolidated, including their CEO, a compact, watchful man named Gerald Fitch, who had the demeanor of someone who was always doing 2 calculations at once. Fitch was standing near the window when Caleb came in, speaking quietly with a woman Caleb didn't recognize. As Caleb moved toward the back of the room, Fitch glanced over, and then did something slightly unexpected. He held eye contact for a beat longer than strangers usually do, and gave a small, precise nod, as if he recognized Caleb from something. Caleb couldn't account for that. He took a spot near the back wall and waited. Victoria Sterling entered at 10:52. Caleb had seen her in person twice, both times from a distance, both times in large group settings. In photographs, she looked polished. In person, she was something more than that. The particular kind of presence that fills a room not by trying, but by arriving. She was 51, had built Sterling Dynamics from a regional compliance consultancy into a national infrastructure firm over 2 decades, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had been right more times than wrong, and had, perhaps, stopped distinguishing between the two. She moved through the room, working the space with a practiced ease, names, handshakes, a specific warmth deployed precisely, until she reached Gerald Fitch and the energy in the room shifted slightly, the way it does when the 2 principals of a major deal are finally in the same space. "Gerald," she said, "today's the day." "It is," Fitch said. His smile was real, but his eyes stayed measured. The presentations began. Sterling's CFO spoke about projected revenue integration. A senior partner from the legal team walked through the contract structure, at a level of generality that impressed Caleb in the worst possible way. The kind of overview that sounds thorough because it uses the right words without saying anything that could be pinned down later. The branded displays showed timelines and growth curves. Caleb stood at the back and felt the memo he'd sent sitting in his chest like a stone. At 11:17, as the CFO was wrapping up and the ceremonial pen and folders were being arranged on the main table, Caleb made a decision. He raised his hand. Nobody acknowledged it for a moment. He kept it raised. Marcus Webb, standing nearby, turned and saw him, and his expression went through several stages in about 1 second. Victoria Sterling looked up from a quiet exchange with her legal partner and noticed the raised hand. She looked at it, then at Caleb, then at the general area around him, as if hoping someone nearby would handle this. "Excuse me," Caleb said, because the hand wasn't working and the clock was still moving. "I'm sorry to interrupt. My name is Caleb Rowan. I'm the lead risk analyst on the Ardent Review. I need 60 seconds before the signing to address a specific clause in the third addendum." The room went quiet in that specific way that means everyone is paying attention while pretending not to. Victoria Sterling looked at him with an expression he would later describe to himself as not quite contempt, more like the look a person gives something that has appeared in an inconvenient place. A glass left on a carpet. A call coming through during dinner. "Mr. Rowan," she said, placing the name carefully, the way you place something fragile. "Legal has reviewed this contract in full. I understand. I'm raising a specific clause that, who authorized your attendance today?" The question landed the way she intended it to. A recalibration, a reminder of hierarchy. "The all-staff invitation," Caleb said. "But that's not, and who did you report this concern to?" "Marcus Webb. Legal intake. I sent a memo an hour ago. Then it's been handled." She said it with the finality of someone closing a folder. "We're about to sign a $480 million partnership. The concerns of a staff analyst have been routed to the appropriate teams. With respect, it hasn't been handled because the signing is happening before Mr. Rowan." Her voice dropped half a degree and somehow got louder. "We have 60 people in this room, a client who has traveled to be here, and a signing that is 4 minutes away. I don't know what you're hoping to accomplish by standing at the back of this room with your hand up, but whatever it is, this is not the moment." She paused, and then she said it. The thing that people in that room would still remember 18 months later. "Leave, before you embarrass yourself. And me." The silence was absolute. Caleb looked at her. He had been in rooms like this before, in a different life, and he knew what they cost. He knew what it meant to push and what it meant to hold. "I have documentation," he said. One more time. Section 14C, third addendum. The benchmark language. "Security doesn't need to be involved in this," Victoria said. It wasn't a question, and that was the thing, not a threat exactly, just a door being closed, with him on the wrong side. Caleb buttoned his jacket. He picked up his folder. He looked briefly at Gerald Fitch, who was watching all of this with the same measured expression he'd worn by the window. And then he walked to the door, and he left. I took the elevator back down to 14. He sat at his desk. He pulled up the memo he'd sent and read it again, not because he thought anything in it was wrong, but because when you've just been walked out of a room in front of 60 people, you need to know the ground under you is solid. It was solid. He checked his email. Nothing from legal, nothing from Marcus. One notification from the compliance intake system, auto-generated, confirming that his submission had been received and was pending review. He thought about calling his sister Rachel, who had watched Dylan twice this week when his school schedule didn't align with Caleb's. He thought about the school pickup at 3:15. He thought, oddly, about a conversation he'd had with Dylan 2 months ago, when Dylan had asked him why he didn't work somewhere fancier if he was so smart. Because smart isn't always the point, Caleb had told him. Sometimes the point is right. What if being right doesn't matter? It matters. It just doesn't always happen fast. At 11:31, his phone lit up with a text from a number he didn't recognize. "Check your news alerts, GF." He didn't know anyone with those initials. He looked at the news. The headline was already loading on 2 financial sites. Ardent consolidated withdrawals from Sterling Dynamics Partnership. CEO cites unresolved contractual concerns. Caleb set his phone face down on his desk and sat very still for a moment. Then he picked it up and read the full article. Ardent Consolidated had officially withdrawn from the agreement. Their statement, attributed to Gerald Fitch, was brief and specific. Ardent Consolidated has determined that certain contractual provisions require further review before we can proceed in good conscience. We remain open to future discussions, but at this time we cannot sign this agreement. The article included a detail that Caleb read twice. According to a source close to the Ardent team, the specific provision that triggered the withdrawal was located in the third addendum. Section 14C. Caleb sat there. Outside his cubicle, he could hear voices picking up, people coming back from the 38th floor, phones ringing, the particular low-frequency buzz of an organization absorbing bad news. Someone said, "What happened?" Someone else said, "Are you serious?" And someone, far enough away that Caleb couldn't identify the voice, said the number. 480. Gone. Marcus Webb appeared at his cubicle entrance. His face was the color of old paper. "Caleb," he said. "I know," Caleb said. How long have you—" 11 days, Caleb said. He wasn't angry. He was something past angry, in the place that is quiet and very clear. The memo timestamp will confirm that, along with the 2 prior escalations. Marcus opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the wall. "You should probably," Caleb said, "make some calls." Marcus left. Caleb opened his desk drawer and took out the small framed photo he kept there, not on top of the desk where anyone could see it, just inside the drawer where he could find it if he needed to. Dylan, age 6, in a batting helmet 3 sizes too large, grinning at something off camera. Caleb looked at it for a moment, put it back. His computer pinged. An email from an address he didn't recognize, a personal Gmail account, not a Sterling domain. The subject line was blank. The body contained 4 words. "I saw you there." And below that, a phone number. Caleb looked at the initials on the earlier text. GF, Gerald Fitch. He looked at the number. He didn't dial it. Not yet. He saved it, closed the email, and locked his screen. Then he picked up his coffee, still lukewarm, still bad, and drank the rest of it. Around him, Sterling Dynamics was beginning to understand what it had lost. Phones rang. Doors closed. Somewhere on the 38th floor, Victoria Sterling was sitting in the wreckage of an 11-minute collapse and trying to figure out how a $480 million signing had turned into a headline about unresolved contractual concerns. Caleb knew exactly how. He had put it in writing, 3 times. He pulled up his task queue and started working on the next file, because the work didn't stop because a bad day happened, and Dylan had soccer on Thursday, and groceries needed to happen before then. And whatever came next, whatever investigation, whatever fallout, whatever phone calls were going to start coming in the next few hours. Caleb Rowan had learned a long time ago that you don't prepare for the storm by watching the sky. You prepare by keeping your records clean and your footing steady. His records were clean, his footing was steady. He got back to work. The number sat in Caleb's phone for 6 hours before anything else happened. In that time, Sterling Dynamics went through the particular kind of institutional convulsion that follows a public collapse, the kind where everyone is moving very fast and accomplishing very little, where meetings are called and then postponed and then called again, where the people who were loudest in the conference room that morning are suddenly very quiet and very busy rearranging their email trails. Caleb watched it from 14, the way you watch weather from inside a building, close enough to see it clearly, far enough to stay dry. Marcus Webb came back twice, the first time to ask whether Caleb had spoken to anyone from communications, the second time to ask, in a voice pitched lower than usual, whether Caleb had retained copies of his escalation emails. Caleb told him yes to the second question and didn't answer the first, because the first wasn't really a question. It was a warning dressed up as concern, and Caleb had been around long enough to know the difference. By 4 o'clock, the floor had thinned out. People leaving early, some of them with the specific body language of people who had already sent their resumes somewhere. Caleb finished his current file, locked his screen, packed his bag, and left at 3:50 to make the school pickup on time, because whatever Sterling Dynamics was going through, Dylan got out at 3:15 and needed someone there. He was 7 minutes late. Dylan was sitting on the front steps with his backpack on both shoulders and his jacket half zipped, talking to another kid about something that involved a lot of hand gestures. When he saw Caleb's car, he said something quick to the other kid and jogged over. "You're late," Dylan said, getting in. 7 minutes. Still late. "You're right. Caleb pulled out. How was school? Fine. Brendan said his dad's company is in the news. Is yours? Caleb looked at the road. Something like that. Good news or bad news? Depends on who you ask. Dylan considered this with the particular seriousness of a 9-year-old who has learned that adult answers usually mean the conversation is done. He looked out the window. Are we okay? Yeah, Caleb said. We're okay. That night, after dinner and homework and the usual argument about screen time that Caleb lost partially, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and dialed the number from the email. It rang twice. I wondered when you'd call, Gerald Fitch said. His voice was the same in private as it had been in that conference room, measured, deliberate, with a quality of attention that felt almost physical, like he was actually listening instead of waiting for his turn to speak. Your initials were on the text, Caleb said. Didn't take long. No, I imagine it didn't. A brief pause. I want you to know that we pulled the contract because of Section 14C, specifically because of the benchmark language in the performance guarantee provision. I know, Caleb said. That's what I tried to tell them. You did. I saw you try. Another pause, this one longer. I also saw how they responded. I want you to know that was a factor in our decision. Not the only one, but a factor. Caleb didn't say anything for a moment. What do you mean, a factor? I mean that when a company's CEO publicly dismisses the one person raising a legitimate concern 3 hours before a major signing in front of the client, Fitch stopped. It tells you something about how that company operates, about what gets heard and what doesn't. He paused again. We've had a bad experience with that kind of culture before. We weren't going to walk into it again. Caleb absorbed that. You knew about the clause before today. Our legal team flagged it 2 days ago. We were waiting to see how Sterling handled it, whether anyone internally would raise it. A dry, quiet sound that might have been a laugh. You raised it. And then got walked out of the room. Fitch agreed, which answered our question. Caleb was quiet for a moment. From down the hall, he could hear the sound of Dylan's tablet, some video, the tinny audio of something animated. Why are you telling me this? Because I think you should know that what you did today was seen, and because, Fitch seemed to choose his next words carefully, I suspect the situation at Sterling is about to become more complicated than a failed signing. And if that's the case, I want there to be at least one person in that building who has the full picture. After they hung up, Caleb sat at the kitchen table for a long time, not moving, the laptop open in front of him with the screen gone dark. He wasn't sure exactly what Fitch meant by more complicated, but the phrase sat in him the way a wrong number sits in a document, small, specific, impossible to attribute to accident. He opened his laptop and started pulling files. The full picture took 4 days to come into focus, and it was worse than anything Caleb had modeled. He didn't go looking for Damien Cross specifically. He went looking for the contract, specifically for the version history, the track changes, the sequence of edits that showed how Section 14C had evolved from the draft stage to the final executed document. It was the kind of forensic work that most people in his position didn't have the access or the methodology to do, but Caleb had spent the better part of his career building the kind of documentation habits that made this sort of backward reading possible. He kept secure backup copies of every major file he worked on, not on Sterling's primary servers, but on an encrypted external system he'd established years ago for exactly this reason, after watching a prior employer lose critical records in what was officially described as a server migration incident. What the version history showed him was that Section 14C, in its original form, was a standard performance guarantee clause. The benchmark language, the specific, nearly impossible-to-meet performance standards that made it a liability trapdoor, had been inserted in the 7th revision. The 7th revision was dated 11 weeks ago. The 7th revision had been made by a user account registered to Damien Cross, Senior Executive Vice President of Strategic Partnerships. Caleb looked at that for a very long time. Then he looked at the 8th and 9th revisions, both of which bore the same account signature, both of which made further modifications to the addendum language that had the cumulative effect of making the clause simultaneously harder to notice and more devastating in its implications. The kind of changes that looked in isolation like editorial tightening. The kind of changes that required you to hold the original and the final version side by side to understand what had actually been altered. He pulled Damien Cross's name through the internal research database he had access to as a senior analyst. What came back was a standard executive profile, 15 years at Sterling, a long list of partnership deals credited to his work, a reputation as the company's most aggressive business development officer. The kind of person who showed up at the right events, knew the right names, moved through corridors with the ease of someone who had made himself structurally indispensable. He also found something else. Cross had published, over the past 4 years, a series of articles in 3 industry journals, articles on corporate risk architecture, on partnership structure and managed infrastructure deals, on the methodology for identifying and neutralizing hidden liability clauses in complex contracts. Caleb read the first one and felt something settle in his chest like a dropped weight. He recognized the framework, not in a vague general sense. He recognized the specific analytical matrix, the 4-axis liability mapping model, the terminology around what the article called cascading benchmark exposure, the precise way the risk taxonomy was organized. He had developed that framework himself 6 years ago as part of an internal methodology project. He had shared it with his team, written it up, submitted it to Sterling's internal knowledge base. He had never published it externally. He had never put his name on it publicly. That had been a choice, deliberate, consistent with everything else about the way Caleb had structured his career, to do the work without the visibility. Damien Cross had published it, under his own name, 3 times, in journals that conferred exactly the kind of professional credibility that made you look like a thought leader instead of a suit. Caleb sat with that for a moment. He wasn't surprised, not exactly, but there was a specific kind of anger that comes not from being wronged, but from understanding for the first time how long you've been wronged, and how many of the things you assumed were simply overlooked were actually, quietly, taken. That kind of anger doesn't make noise. It makes decisions. He kept pulling. What he found over the next 2 days, working in the evenings after Dylan was in bed, was a pattern. 6 years of it. Presentations that carried Cross's name but contained analytical structures Caleb had developed. Risk assessments submitted to clients with Cross listed as the primary author. The underlying methodology traceable to memos Caleb had circulated internally. Not always. Not every piece. But enough, and consistently enough, to make accident an implausible explanation. And then there was the fund. It took him an extra day to find it, and when he did, he almost missed it, buried in a financial disclosure filing associated with a holding company that had no obvious connection to Sterling Dynamics until you followed the ownership chain through 2 intermediary entities and found a name that appeared in Sterling's own board documentation. The fund was called Hargrove Capital Partners. It was a private investment vehicle. Among its listed advisors was Damien Cross, and Hargrove Capital Partners had, in the 6 months prior to the Ardent signing, quietly acquired a significant short position in Sterling Dynamics stock. A short position, meaning they stood to profit substantially if Sterling's stock price fell. Sterling stock had fallen 22% in the 3 days following the Ardent collapse. Caleb closed his laptop, went to the kitchen, and stood at the sink running cold water over his hands for no particular reason except that he needed to do something with them. He thought about the benchmark language in Section 14C. He thought about it being inserted at the 7th revision. He thought about the timing, 11 weeks ago, while the contract was still being negotiated, while Ardent was still months away from committing to the signing date. Someone had built the trapdoor before they invited the company to walk through it. He dried his hands, went back to the laptop, opened a new encrypted folder and started organizing what he had into a sequence that could be followed by someone who hadn't spent the last 4 days inside it. He didn't call anyone that night. He wasn't ready. There were gaps still, and Caleb had learned a long time ago that a story with gaps doesn't hold, that the moment you present something incomplete, the incomplete parts become the argument against everything else. He needed it whole before he moved. He went to check on Dylan, who was asleep with one arm hanging off the mattress and a library book open on the floor beside the bed. Caleb picked up the book, put it on the nightstand, and stood there a moment in the dark. His son slept the way kids sleep when they feel safe, which is deeply and without reservation. Caleb watched him and felt the particular weight of being the only person standing between that kind of sleep and the world. He went back to work. Victoria Sterling did not sleep well that week. This was not unusual for her. She had never been a reliable sleeper, had run on less rest than most people for most of her adult career, had treated sleep as a negotiation rather than a requirement. But the days after the Ardent collapse were different. It wasn't insomnia so much as a specific, grinding inability to settle, the way a machine runs rough when something in the mechanism is out of alignment. The board was restless. She'd had 3 calls with Howard Mercer, the board chairman, in the 48 hours after the signing fell apart. Mercer was 67, a former investment banker, and possessed of the specific diplomatic fluency of men who had learned to deliver very bad news in language that technically contained no threat. What he communicated in those 3 calls, without ever saying it plainly, was that the board's patience was a resource she had significantly drawn down. The press narrative is hardening, he told her on the 3rd call. 480 vanished, and nobody can explain it without it sounding like incompetence. The board needs to see active management, a plan. I'm working on a plan, she said. Good. Because a plan that starts with accountability is better received than one that starts with damage control. You understand the difference. She understood the difference. What she didn't understand yet, what was still assembling itself piece by piece in the space behind her normal thoughts, was where the failure had actually originated. She had spent 2 days assuming she knew. The legal team had missed something. The review had been inadequate. The pressure to close had been too high. These were failures she could manage because they were institutional and she was the institution. But on the 3rd day, her executive assistant, a careful, observant woman named Petra, who had worked for Victoria for 6 years and had the useful quality of noticing things without being asked, set a folder on her desk and said, with no particular emphasis, "Legal sent over the contract version history. I thought you'd want to see it." Victoria looked at the version history for 40 minutes. When she came out of her office, she went directly to Damian Cross's floor. Damian Cross had the corner office on 36, which he had occupied for 4 years with the ease of a man who considered it his natural territory. He was on the phone when Victoria walked in, and he made the mistake of holding up one finger, the universal signal for one moment, which was not a signal Victoria Sterling recognized as applicable to her. She sat down across from him and waited. He wrapped up the call faster than he'd intended to and set the phone down. "Victoria, what can I do for—" "The 7th revision of the Ardent contract," she said. "Section 14C. Who reviewed it before it went to the final draft?" Something moved across Damian's face. Not guilt exactly, more the micro-expression of someone who has been prepared for a question and is now deploying the prepared answer. Legal reviewed all revisions, standard process. If there was a problem with the clause, that's a legal oversight issue, not— "The 7th revision was edited under your user account," Victoria said. A beat. Briefer than it should have been. "I make a lot of edits across a lot of documents. If you're suggesting I'm responsible for a legal team missing something in the review, I'm asking you a specific question about a specific revision. Walk me through what you changed in that section." "Victoria, I don't have every edit memorized. I'd need to pull the document." "Pull it." He pulled it. He was good. She would give him that. He sat there with the document open, tracing through the language, explaining the edits with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed exactly this conversation, and nothing he said was technically false, which was what made it so difficult to push against. He talked about tightening the performance language for clarity, about aligning the benchmark structure with industry standards, about how the legal team's sign-off post-revision should have caught any issues. Victoria listened. She watched his hands. He had the unconscious habit of touching the edge of his desk when he was managing something. A small rhythmic press with 2 fingers, almost like counting. He was counting right now. "I want every contract you've touched in the last 18 months pulled for review," she said when he'd finished. "Every one. I want the version histories." "That's—" he paused. "That's a significant undertaking. If you're concerned about— I'm concerned about what I'm concerned about. Make it happen." She stood up and left. In the elevator going back up, she thought about Caleb Rowan standing at the back of that ceremony room with his hand up and his folder in his arms. And she thought about the words she'd said to him, and she had the specific uncomfortable experience of a person who has been very certain of themselves, discovering that their certainty was built on a foundation they hadn't examined. She didn't like the feeling. She also didn't dismiss it, because whatever else Victoria Sterling was, she had not built 2 decades of business by refusing to look at uncomfortable things. She had just, in this case, looked too late. She called Petra from the elevator. Find me a direct contact for Caleb Rowan, not through Marcus Webb, directly. He's still on the staff roster, Petra said. I can get his work extension. Get me a cell number if we have it on file. And Petra, don't route this through anyone, just me. Caleb's phone rang at 7:40 in the evening, the day he'd finished organizing the encrypted folder. Dylan was at the table working on a history worksheet, using a pencil with the eraser worn completely down to the metal. Caleb was washing dishes. He looked at the number, unfamiliar, but a Sterling Dynamics Exchange prefix, and let it ring once more before answering. Mr. Rowan? Victoria Sterling's voice was different on the phone than it had been in the conference room. Not softer, exactly. More unguarded, the way voices sound when they don't have an audience. This is Victoria Sterling. He kept his voice neutral. Ms. Sterling. I'm calling because I've been reviewing the Ardent contract version history. A pause that felt genuine rather than calculated. I owe you an apology. What I said to you in that room was, it was wrong. And more to the point, you were right about the clause, and you tried to tell us, and I shut you down in front of 60 people, and I'm not going to pretend that was anything other than what it was. Caleb looked at Dylan, who was erasing something and frowning at the page. I appreciate you saying that. I'm also calling because I think the Ardent collapse is not the whole problem. I'm starting to believe there's something else here, something that runs deeper, and She stopped. A sound like she was choosing between two things and picking the harder one. I think I need someone who actually understands what they're looking at. And based on the version history, and based on what you raised before the signing, you clearly do. Caleb dried his hands on a dish towel. He thought about the encrypted folder. He thought about Hargrove Capital Partners. He thought about the short position and the 7th revision and 6 years of published papers carrying someone else's name. Ms. Sterling, he said, I think you're right that it runs deeper, but I'm going to need to show you what I've found in a controlled setting, with documentation, and I'm going to need certain assurances about how that information is handled before I share it. A silence. Then, what kind of assurances? That it doesn't go through Damien Cross, that it doesn't go through legal without my presence, and that a copy goes to an outside party simultaneously so that there's no version of this where what I've found disappears. Another silence. Longer this time. He heard her breath, short, controlled, the breathing of someone recalibrating. Okay, she said. Name the outside party. Caleb looked out the kitchen window at the dark. I'll have a name for you tomorrow. After he hung up, Dylan looked up from his worksheet. Who was that? Someone from work. The CEO? Caleb looked at his son. Why would you ask that? Dylan shrugged with one shoulder, the way he did when he was trying to look like he wasn't paying attention. You said Ms. Sterling. Caleb was quiet a moment. Yeah, that was her. Is everything okay? He thought about what okay looked like from the outside versus what it felt like from the inside. He thought about the folder on his encrypted drive and the names it contained and the amount of damage those names had done, quietly, over years, to people who had done their work and kept their heads down and trusted that the system would hold. It's going to be, he said. Go finish your homework. Dylan went back to his worksheet. Caleb stood at the sink a moment longer, looking at nothing in particular. He picked up his phone and sent a short message to Gerald Fitch. I may need an outside channel. Are you willing? The reply came back in under 3 minutes. Yes. Caleb put his phone in his pocket and went to help Dylan with the history questions, because the history worksheet was due tomorrow and the larger problems could wait another hour. And there was a rule in this house, his own rule, one he'd set when Dylan was small, and it had been just the two of them, and rules were the thing that made everything feel stable. That the table was for dinner and homework, and not for the things that kept adults awake at night. The things that kept adults awake at night were for after. He sat down across from his son and looked at the worksheet. One of the questions asked about what happens when people in power fail to listen to the people around them. Dylan had written, bad things happen that could have been avoided. Caleb looked at that for a moment. Then he nodded and said, That's right. That's exactly right. Gerald Fitch said yes, and that was the first solid thing Caleb had to stand on. He spent the next morning rearranging the encrypted folder into 3 separate packages. The first was the contract version history, clean, time-stamped, traceable. The second was the pattern of intellectual theft, The 6 years of published papers, the internal memos they'd been drawn from, the dates and the discrepancies laid side by side in a format that required no interpretation to understand. The third was the financial thread, Hargrove Capital Partners, the ownership chain, the short position, the timeline that placed Damian Cross inside a fund that had profited directly from a collapse he had engineered. He didn't send any of it yet. He printed hard copies, sealed them in 3 separate envelopes, and put 2 of them in the messenger bag. He took to work, and one in the filing cabinet at home, behind Dylan's old-school records where nobody would think to look. He was at his desk by 8. At 8:47, an email arrived from Petra, Victoria's assistant, with a time and a room number. 9th floor. A conference room that wasn't assigned to any specific department, the kind of neutral space that said this meeting doesn't exist on the official calendar. 11 o'clock. Caleb replied, "Confirmed. I'll need a secure connection and a projector." Petra's response came back in 4 minutes. Done. He worked until 10:30, then took the stairs. Victoria was already there when he arrived, which he hadn't expected. She was standing at the window with a coffee cup and no jacket, just a dark blouse and the particular posture of someone who has been thinking hard for several days and is tired in a way that sleep won't fix. She looked, for the first time since Caleb had seen her, like a person rather than a position. There was one other person in the room, a woman in her 40s, sharp-eyed, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a legal pad in front of her. Victoria introduced her as Claire Ashworth, outside counsel, not Sterling's in-house legal team. Brought in privately, she explained, which was consistent with the assurances Caleb had asked for. "Mr. Rowan," Victoria said. She didn't offer her hand. Something in her posture acknowledged that a handshake would have felt inadequate. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for the room," Caleb said, setting his bag on the table. He glanced at Ashworth. "Everything I show you today has already been copied to an external party. That's not a threat. It's a condition of disclosure. It means what I'm about to share can't be made to disappear." Ashworth looked at Victoria. Victoria nodded. "We understand." "Okay," Caleb said. He opened his laptop. He walked them through it in order. Not because he wanted to build drama. He specifically did not want to build drama, because drama was what people used to argue about while the substance got buried, but because the sequence mattered. The original clause, the 7th revision, the account signature, Cross's name, sitting there in the metadata like something that had never expected to be read. Victoria set her coffee down halfway through and didn't pick it up again. Then the papers, the published framework, the internal memo it had come from, the dates. Caleb kept his voice even. He didn't say he stole this because he didn't need to. The document said it, and saying it himself would have made it sound like grievance rather than evidence. Claire Ashworth was writing steadily. She had the focus of someone who turns information into structure automatically, the way a musician hears melody in noise. Then Hargrove Capital Partners, the ownership chain, the short position. The room went quiet in a particular way. Not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet of weight. The specific silence that follows when someone understands the actual size of what they're looking at. "He shorted the company," Victoria said. Not a question. "The fund did. He's listed as an advisor, not a principal. It'll take proper forensic accounting to establish the full picture. But the timeline," Caleb pulled up the dates side by side. "The position was established 6 weeks before the signing. The benchmark language was inserted 11 weeks before. The sequence is not ambiguous." Victoria looked at the screen for a long time. He built in the failure. He built in a failure mechanism and then positioned financially to benefit from it. Someone had to do the final trigger, whether that was ensuring Ardent's team would find the clause or ensuring it wouldn't be corrected before signing. I don't know which yet. He paused. But Ardent knew. Gerald Fitch's legal team found the clause 2 days before the signing. They were watching to see if Sterling would catch it internally. "And we didn't," Victoria said, "because every escalation," she stopped, "was going through channels that Damian Cross either controlled or influenced." Caleb closed the laptop. "Yes." The silence stretched. Claire Ashworth finished a line on her legal pad and looked up. "This is enough to open a formal investigation. If even a portion of this holds under forensic review, you're looking at securities fraud, intellectual property theft, and potential conspiracy. This goes well beyond internal disciplinary action." I know, Caleb said. How long have you had this? Victoria asked. Not accusatory. Something more like genuine asking. Most of it, 4 days. The financial piece took longer to trace. He looked at her directly. The intellectual property issue. That's been happening for 6 years. I didn't know the full scope until I started pulling threads from the Ardent situation. Something crossed Victoria's face at that. Complicated. He couldn't have named it precisely. Not guilt exactly, because guilt was too simple. More like the expression of someone recalculating a series of decisions they thought they understood and discovering the inputs were wrong. I need to brief the board, she said. Before you do, Caleb said, I need to tell you something about the board. Howard Mercer's name appeared in the Hargrove Capital Partners documentation in a place that took Caleb 2 days to find, not in the fund's official advisory listing, not in any document that Hargrove had filed publicly, but in a set of internal communications that had been part of a prior regulatory disclosure and were technically public record, buried in a filing database that most people didn't know existed and fewer still knew how to search. Mercer wasn't listed as an advisor. He was listed as a limited partner, a financial participant. Someone who had put money into Hargrove Capital Partners 14 months ago and stood to share in whatever return the fund generated. Hargrove had generated a significant return in the 3 days after the Ardent collapse. Caleb laid that piece down last, the way you lay down a card you've been holding since the first hand. He watched Victoria's face go through its recalibration in real time. The slight tightening around the eyes, the controlled exhale, the particular stillness that precedes a decision. Howard, she said, quietly, almost to herself. I can't confirm the full extent of his involvement without forensic accounting. What I can show you is that he was a financial participant in a fund that directly benefited from this company's collapse. That's a material conflict of interest at minimum. What it is beyond that is for investigators to determine. Claire Ashworth had stopped writing. She was looking at Caleb with a focused attention that felt different from before. Where did you get the filing? Public record. I can show you the database path. He glanced at her. It's not hacked, it's not stolen. It's a regulatory disclosure that nobody searched because nobody knew to look. Nobody except you. I had a reason to look, Caleb said simply. Victoria stood up. She walked to the window and stood there with her back to them for a moment. Not dramatically, just the way a person stands when they need to not be looked at while they think. When she turned back, something had settled in her face. The uncertainty was still there, but it had organized itself into something functional. I can't brief the board, she said. Not through Mercer, not through the standard channels. No, Caleb said. Claire. She looked at Ashworth. What do we do? Claire Ashworth put her pen down and folded her hands on the legal pad in the manner of someone who has handled complicated situations before and knows that complication doesn't respond to panic. We go outside. Regulatory authority. Securities and exchange oversight given the short position. We need to move before Cross has any indication this has surfaced, which means today, before end of business. He doesn't know yet, Caleb said. But I have reason to believe he's been monitoring the internal investigation Victoria ordered, the one into the contract versions. If he's watching that, he may already be taking steps. What kind of steps? Victoria asked. Deletion. The version history lives on Sterling's primary servers. The 7th revision metadata is there now, but if he has admin-level access or knows someone who does... Victoria was already reaching for her phone. She dialed Petra. I need you to contact IT security right now. Full server lockdown on the Ardent contract files. No deletions, no access changes, nothing. I don't care what reason anyone gives. Lock it and call me back. She hung up. Looked at Caleb. What else? The published papers. Cross's name is on them, but the journals will have submission records. Those are external. Sterling can't touch them. I'd recommend contacting the journals directly today, before anything else moves. I'll handle that, Ashworth said, already writing. And the Hargrove filing, Caleb said. I've already saved a copy outside Sterling's systems. Fitch has a copy too, so does... He paused. There's a third copy in a location I'm not going to name right now. If something happens to me or to either of the other copies, the third one goes to the financial press automatically. That's not a threat either. It's a safeguard. Victoria looked at him. A long, direct look, the kind that happens when you're seeing someone clearly for the first time and trying to account for all the time you spent not seeing them. You've been very careful, she said. I have a 9-year-old, Caleb said. Careful is how I operate. She absorbed that without comment. There was something in her face that he couldn't read. Not pity, not quite respect. Something closer to the specific recognition that comes when you realize you've spent years measuring someone by the wrong standard. Okay, she said. What do you need from me? What he needed from her was access and authority, and she gave him both, which he hadn't been entirely certain she would. The access was to Sterling's internal audit records going back 6 years, records that, combined with what he'd already compiled, would build a complete picture of the intellectual property trail. The authority was a written directive, signed by Victoria as CEO, designating Caleb as a temporary internal investigator with protected status, meaning his work product couldn't be altered or deleted by anyone inside the company without triggering a formal compliance flag. Claire Ashworth drafted it in 20 minutes. Victoria signed it in the room. Caleb looked at it for a moment after she signed. The specific, slightly surreal experience of holding a document that 4 days ago would have been incomprehensible and now felt, somehow, like exactly the right weight in his hands. I need to make a call, he said, and stepped into the hall. Gerald Fitch picked up on the second ring. It's broader than the contract, Caleb said. I need you to hold what I sent you and be prepared to release it to a specific regulatory contact if I give you the word. I'll send you the contact's information today. Understood, Fitch said. Is this moving? Today. Yes. A pause. Caleb. Fitch's voice had something in it, not warmth exactly, more like the careful regard one careful person has for another. You should know that we didn't pull the contract to hurt Sterling. We pulled it because we couldn't sign something that was designed to fail. I know, Caleb said. When this is resolved, I'd like to talk about what a real agreement looks like. So would I, Fitch said. Caleb went back into the room. The problem arrived at 2:17 in the afternoon in the form of an alert from IT security. Someone had attempted to access the Ardent contract file server at 2:09, 8 minutes after Victoria's lockdown order. The access attempt had been blocked. The account that made the attempt was registered to an administrative assistant in the Strategic Partnerships Department, Cross's department. Victoria showed Caleb the alert on her phone. He read it and said nothing for a moment. He knows, Victoria said, or he's operating on a schedule and the timing is coincidence. Caleb handed the phone back. I wouldn't bet on coincidence. Neither would I. She typed something. I'm having his office keycard suspended and his remote access revoked. If he's in the building, he is, Caleb said. He didn't know this for certain, but Damian Cross was not the kind of man who operated from home when things were in motion. He would want to be close to the situation, in control of what he could see. The next 40 minutes were the kind that don't look dramatic from the outside. A series of calls, documents moving between secure channels, 2 separate regulatory contacts being briefed by Claire Ashworth in careful, specific language. Caleb spent 20 of those minutes in the IT security office on the 2nd floor with a forensic specialist named Rob Ewan, who had the compact efficiency of someone who'd been doing this work for a long time and had strong opinions about people who tried to delete evidence. The attempt failed, Ewan said, going through the logs on his screen. But whoever made it knew the file structure. This isn't a random access attempt. They knew exactly what folder to hit. Is there a way to tell if they got anything before the lockdown? Ewan checked. No, the lockdown caught it clean. Nothing was altered or removed. Caleb let out a breath he hadn't been tracking. Can you preserve the access attempt log as evidence? Already done. Ewan glanced at him sideways. You want to tell me what's going on? Not yet, but when I can, you'll be one of the first people I tell. Ewan nodded, turned back to his screen. The log's going nowhere. Caleb went back upstairs. At 3:45, Damian Cross called Victoria's office. Petra told him she was unavailable. He called her cell phone. She didn't answer. He appeared at the 38th floor at 4:02, which is when things stopped being quiet. Caleb heard about it from Petra, who texted Victoria while Victoria was in a call with Claire Ashworth, and who had the presence of mind to write, DC is at reception asking for you. Seems agitated. Security is here. Victoria ended the call. She looked at Caleb across the table. He's upstairs. Don't see him alone, Caleb said. I wasn't planning to. She stood, straightened her jacket, and did something Caleb hadn't anticipated. She looked at him and said, "Come with me." He started to say that wasn't necessary, that she had security, that the documentation was already secured, and then he stopped, because that wasn't the point. The point was that Victoria Sterling was walking into the room where 9 days ago she had dismissed him in front of 60 people, and she was asking him to walk in with her, and whatever that meant about where things stood between them, it was different from where they'd been. He stood up. "Okay." Damian Cross was not what most people pictured when they imagined corporate betrayal. He didn't look sharp or cold or calculating in any way that would have triggered immediate distrust. He was 50-ish, broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy confidence that read as competence right up until you knew what was underneath it. He was standing near the reception desk on 38 with his jacket on and his hands in his pockets, which was the body language of a man trying very hard to look relaxed. When Victoria came through the door, he shifted forward slightly. When he saw Caleb behind her, he went still, not surprised, recalibrating. "Victoria," he said, "I've been trying to reach you." "I know," she said. "Come into the conference room." The three of them sat down. Cross looked at Caleb the way you look at something that has appeared in the wrong place. Not quite hostility, more the focused attention of someone reassessing a situation in real time. "What is this?" Cross said. "I'd like you to walk me through your relationship with Hargrove Capital Partners," Victoria said. The recalibration was visible now, a brief tightening, a decision made somewhere behind his eyes. "I've advised several investment vehicles over the years. That's not unusual for someone at my level." "Were you advising Hargrove when they established a short position in Sterling Dynamics stock?" "Victoria, were you?" He looked at her. The easy confidence was still present, but it had changed texture, less like natural ease and more like a surface. "I think," he said carefully, "that before this conversation goes further, I should have counsel present." "That's your right," Victoria said. "The conversation can wait. What can't wait is this." She slid a printed document across the table. The server access alert from IT, with the timestamp and the account notation. "Someone accessed the Ardent contract file server at 2:09 today, using an account from your department. 8 minutes after I ordered a lockdown." Cross looked at the document, said nothing. "I'm not asking you to explain it right now," Victoria said. "I'm telling you that I have it. And I'm telling you that what I have is already in the hands of outside legal counsel, a regulatory contact, and a third party external to this company." She said it the way Caleb had said it to her, not as a threat, as information. "So wherever this goes from here, it goes there with a complete record." Cross was quiet for a moment. Something in his face moved, not toward guilt, more toward a kind of tired calculation. He'd been running the play for 6 years and the play had worked, right up until it didn't, and now he was in the specific position of a man who has held a very complicated hand and is watching the table turn. He looked at Caleb. "You put this together." Caleb met his eyes. "You put it together. I just read it." Cross looked back at Victoria. "I want my lawyer." "Call them," she said. She stood up. "Your access credentials have been suspended. Security will escort you from the building. You're not being terminated at this moment. That process will follow whatever the regulatory investigation determines. But you're not coming back in here until it does." Cross stood slowly. He looked for a moment like he was going to say something, something pointed, maybe something that would have been designed to reframe the situation or shift the gravity back toward himself. He was very good at that. He'd been doing it for years. But he looked at the document on the table, and at Victoria, and at Caleb, and whatever he'd been about to say, he kept. He walked out with security on either side, and the door closed behind him, and the room was quiet. Victoria sat back down. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at them. 6 years, she said. "At minimum," Caleb said. "The earlier work might go back further. I only had access to the past 6. And I never—" She stopped, started again differently. "He was in my inner circle. Every major deal in the last 8 years went through him. I trusted his judgment. I promoted him." She looked up. "All of it built on what he took from you." Caleb didn't respond immediately because there wasn't a clean response to that. It was true and complicated, and saying it's okay would have been false, and saying it's not would have been beside the point. "What matters now," he said, "is what the investigation surfaces. And making sure the employees who had nothing to do with any of this don't end up paying for it. Victoria looked at him. The implementation team. The Ardent project team. 43 people were briefed on project commencement. They've been in limbo since the collapse. They need a resolution that doesn't end with layoffs because of something they had no part in. I know. She said it simply, without the CEO register. Just a person acknowledging a thing that mattered. I know. At 6:15, Claire Ashworth confirmed that the regulatory filing had been initiated. The financial fraud unit had acknowledged receipt. The intellectual property documentation had been submitted to the 3 journals that had published Cross's papers, with a formal request for submission record review. The Hargrove Capital Partners connection, including Mercer's limited partnership stake, had been included in the regulatory filing. Howard Mercer called Victoria at 6:42. She let it go to voicemail. She listened to the message afterward. Caleb wasn't in the room, but she described it to him later in 3 words. He knows too. Caleb was at his desk on 14 at 7:03, the floor nearly empty, the lights on the lower setting that kicked in automatically after 6. He was writing a summary, not for filing, just for himself, the kind of thing you write when you need to know you have a clear account of events, in case your memory turns unreliable under the weight of how much has happened in 9 days. His phone buzzed. Dylan, from the tablet at Rachel's house where he was spending the evening. Can we have pizza Friday? Caleb typed back. Yes. Pepperoni? Obviously. A pause. Then, Dad, are you okay? He looked at that for a moment. His kid, 9 years old, picking up on something from 3 miles away through the filter of a text message, which was the specific unnerving intelligence of children who've spent enough time watching their parent carry things alone. I'm okay, he typed. Had a long day. Good long. Like good hard or just good? Caleb thought about that. About the folder that was now in the hands of people who could do something with it. About Cross walking out with security. About Victoria sitting at that table with her hands flat and something working in her face that was, if he was reading it right, the early stages of actual change. Not the managed, PR-ready kind, but the kind that happens when a person looks at the record of their own decisions and can't make it come out differently than it does. About Dylan's history worksheet. Bad things happen that could have been avoided. Good hard, he typed back. The best kind. He put his phone in his pocket, closed his laptop, and sat in the quiet for a moment. The floor around him was still, the cubicles dark, the monitors sleeping. 14 floors below, the lobby would be winding down. 38 floors above, or however far above, whatever was left of the evening on the executive floor was being shaped by phone calls and decisions that hadn't existed this morning. 9 days ago, a woman had pointed him toward a door and told him to leave before he embarrassed himself. He'd walked out, and the contract had collapsed 11 minutes later, and the thing that nobody in that room had known, not even him, fully, until now, was that the collapse wasn't the beginning of the damage. It was the moment the damage became visible. He picked up his bag and took the stairs down. The pizza happened on Friday, as promised. Caleb picked up Dylan at 3:15, on time, which Dylan noted with the satisfaction of someone who keeps score, and they drove to the place on Clement Street that Dylan had been loyal to for 2 years on the basis of one visit, the way kids form allegiances, completely and without reservation. They sat in the booth by the window and ordered a large pepperoni and 2 sodas, and Dylan talked about school for approximately 4 minutes before pivoting to a detailed account of something that had happened at recess involving a disputed call in a kickball game, the injustice of which was still clearly fresh. Caleb listened and ate pizza, and for the first time in 10 days, like a person rather than a process. It didn't last. It wasn't supposed to last. That was the nature of a Friday night booth by the window. But it was real while it was happening, and sometimes real for an hour is what gets you through the next several weeks. He looked at his son pulling apart a slice with the focused pleasure of a kid who considers pizza a serious undertaking, and he thought about what was sitting on his desk back at Sterling, and on the desks of 3 regulatory offices, and in Claire Ashworth's file system, and in Gerald Fitch's secured email, and he made a decision that he kept privately. For the next 90 minutes, none of that existed. Dylan looked up. You're doing the thing where you're here, but you're thinking about something else. I'm here, Caleb said. You're doing it right now. I stopped. Dylan considered whether to accept this. He took another bite. Is the work stuff going to be okay? It's going to take a while, but yeah. How long is a while? Weeks, maybe. Could be months for some of it. Dylan chewed, thinking. Rachel says you've been working at night. Rachel talks too much. She said you'd say that. Caleb almost smiled. Finish your pizza. Dylan finished his pizza. They drove home and watched a movie. Dylan's choice. Something animated that Caleb fell half asleep during and then felt guilty about. And by 9 o'clock, the house was quiet and Caleb was at the kitchen table with his laptop. Because a while is still a while, even when you take 90 minutes off from it. The regulatory timeline moved faster than Caleb had expected and slower than Victoria needed. The Securities Division opened a formal inquiry within 4 days of the filing, faster than average, Claire Ashworth said, which suggested the Hargrove Capital Partners connection had landed with the weight she'd expected. The intellectual property journals were slower. 2 of the 3 responded within the week, the third took 11 days, and all 3 eventually confirmed that the submission records showed inconsistencies between the credited author and the underlying documentation. None of them publicly retracted the articles yet. That process had its own timeline. But the records were preserved and the inconsistencies were documented. Howard Mercer resigned from the board on day 8, before the regulatory filing became public knowledge, which told Caleb everything he needed to know about who had talked to whom and what Mercer's legal counsel had advised. His resignation statement cited personal health reasons. The financial press was skeptical, uniformly, and said so with varying degrees of restraint. Damian Cross's attorney contacted Claire Ashworth on day 11 with a proposal that Ashworth described to Victoria and Caleb as the opening move of someone who knows the hand they're holding. Cross was not offering to cooperate. He was offering to not actively obstruct, in exchange for certain considerations regarding the framing of the intellectual property claim. Ashworth recommended declining. Victoria declined. The implementation team, the 43 people who had been briefed on the Ardent project and had spent 2 weeks in the specific professional limbo of working on a project whose basis had collapsed, were addressed directly by Victoria on day 6, in a meeting that Caleb did not attend but that Petra described to him afterward. I told them, plainly, that the project failure was not theirs, that their work had been sound, and that she was committed to finding a resolution that kept them employed. She had not promised a timeline. She had not used the words going forward or exciting new chapter, which, Petra told him, was how you could tell she was being serious rather than corporate. What she had not yet found was a path back to Ardent. That was the gap that sat at the center of everything else, the gap that no regulatory filing or board restructuring could close on its own. Sterling Dynamics needed the Ardent Partnership, or something like it, to justify the infrastructure investment the company had made in anticipation of the contract. Without it, the balance sheet told a story that even a clean investigation wouldn't fix. Caleb knew this. He'd known it since the night the collapse happened, when he'd looked at the news headline and done the math in his head in about 4 seconds. The contract wasn't just revenue. It was the revenue that made the next 2 years of operations viable, which was why, on day 13, he called Gerald Fitch. I want to be clear about something before we talk, Fitch said. He was at his desk. Caleb could hear the ambient quality of a real office rather than a home or car. Ardent isn't coming back to the original deal, not because of the company's situation, because the original deal was structurally flawed, and not entirely by accident. I know, Caleb said. I'm not calling about the original deal. A pause. What are you calling about? I want to talk about what a real one would look like. Silence on the line, not hesitation, more the silence of someone who is paying close attention and not filling space while they do it. Go on, Fitch said. Caleb had spent 3 evenings building the framework because this was the work he actually knew how to do. Not the investigation, not the exposure. Those were necessary, but they were responses. This was his native territory. Reading the shape of a potential partnership, understanding where the risk lived and where it didn't, building a structure that protected both sides without burdening either one with the kind of hidden liability that turned agreements into traps. He laid it out in 20 minutes. Not a pitch. He was deliberate about the tone, kept it analytical rather than persuasive, because Fitch was the kind of person who responded to clarity and was allergic to salesmanship. The core shift was this. Instead of a 6-year fixed commitment with performance guarantees, A phased agreement. 3 stages, each with its own negotiated benchmarks, each requiring both parties to affirmatively confirm before the next stage activated. Independent compliance oversight at every stage, not Sterling's internal team, not Ardent's, but a jointly selected third party with defined authority. Transparent reporting cadences. And the benchmark language, the critical piece, the thing that had been the trapdoor in the original, built collaboratively, with Ardent's legal team and Sterling's in the room at the same time, no backdoor revisions, full version history maintained in a shared system accessible to both parties. When he finished, Fitch was quiet for a moment. "That's not the deal we were offered," Fitch said. "No, it's a better one. It's also more work, more oversight, more exposure to the process on our end." "Yes," Caleb said, "because a deal that protects you only on paper isn't protection, and you know that, because you pulled out of the last one rather than signed something that looked fine on the surface and wasn't." Another silence. Caleb waited. He'd learned a long time ago that the worst thing you could do after making a point was fill the silence that followed it. "I'd need to bring this to our board," Fitch said finally. "I'd expect that. And Sterling would need to demonstrate structurally that the governance failures that allowed the original contract manipulation are being addressed. Not a press release. Actual structural change. Victoria is already working on that. I can get you documentation of the specific reforms being implemented, board composition changes, internal audit independence, compliance reporting structure. And the investigation? Ongoing. The regulatory timeline isn't mine to control, but the documentation we've provided is complete and the inquiry is open." "Caleb." Fitch's voice shifted slightly, still measured, but with something underneath it that was closer to direct. "Why are you bringing this to me instead of Sterling's business development team?" It was a fair question. Caleb had thought about it. Because the business development team, at the level it was operating, was part of the problem. Sterling doesn't currently have the right person in that role, and bringing you a proposal through a channel you have no reason to trust, yet would be the wrong move. He paused. "And because you texted me the night the contract fell apart, you said you saw me there. I think that means something about how you make decisions." The longest silence yet. Caleb counted to 8. "Send me the framework document," Fitch said. "I'll take it to my board this week." "One more thing," Caleb said. "I'd like Victoria on the call when you do, not to manage the conversation, just to be present." "Why?" "Because she needs to hear directly what a client sounds like when they're being treated honestly. And because I think your board needs to see that Sterling's leadership has actually changed, not just reorganized." Fitch considered that. "All right, set it up." Victoria's reaction to the call invitation was not what Caleb had expected, which was acceptance. It was closer to discomfort, the specific discomfort of a person who is not accustomed to being in a room where they don't set the terms. "You want me to sit on a call where you present a framework I haven't fully reviewed to the client we lost, and my job is to..." "What? Listen?" "And answer questions honestly if they're directed at you," Caleb said. "But mostly, yes. Listen." They were in the 9th floor conference room again. Their room now, in a way, by repetition if not by assignment. It was late afternoon, the light coming through the blinds in long, flat angles. Victoria had a cup of coffee she kept picking up and setting down without drinking. "You understand that in 23 years of running this company, I have never walked into a client meeting without being the primary voice in the room." "I know. And you're asking me to do that now, in the highest stakes client conversation we currently have." "Yes." She looked at him. "Why do you think that's the right call?" Caleb thought about how to answer that. He chose honesty because it was the only thing that had worked in the last 2 weeks. Because the way Sterling has operated, the way you've operated, with all the control in one place, all the decisions filtered through one voice, that's part of what allowed Cross to build what he built. He understood the structure. He worked inside it. The oversight gaps he exploited were created by the same concentration of authority that made the company feel stable. Victoria held his gaze. He continued. "Fitch's board is going to look at this proposal and ask themselves whether Sterling has actually changed or just reshuffled. The most convincing answer to that question isn't documentation. It's watching the CEO sit in a room and not be the person running it." A long pause. Victoria looked at the coffee cup. "Put it down. That's going to be uncomfortable." "I imagine so. I'm not..." She stopped, started differently. I'm not good at that, at stepping back. I know, Caleb said. I've noticed. Something shifted in her expression, not offense, closer to the involuntary recognition of someone seeing themselves in a mirror they didn't know was there. You're very direct, she said. You said you needed someone who understood what they were looking at, Caleb said. That's what I'm doing. She was quiet for a moment. Then, without flourish or preamble, she said, All right, set up the call. The call happened on a Tuesday, 2.5 weeks after the original collapse. It ran 93 minutes. Caleb presented the framework. He was methodical and specific and spoke without performing. Just the structure, the rationale, the places where the risk lived and how the proposal addressed each one. Fitch's board asked questions that were direct and, in some cases, pointed. What prevented a recurrence of the internal manipulation? How was the independent oversight body selected and held accountable? What happened in a scenario where the Phase 1 benchmarks were disputed? Caleb answered each one. Where he didn't have a complete answer, he said so and described what would need to be built before that answer existed. At the 40-minute mark, one of Fitch's board members, a woman named Sandra Lim, who had been quiet until then and whose questions, when they came, were the sharpest, looked at the screen and said, Ms. Sterling, your CEO was directly responsible for dismissing the internal warning that would have caught this before the original signing. How are we supposed to trust that the leadership culture has changed rather than just the personnel? The room was quiet in the way that rooms get quiet when a question lands directly on the most important thing. Victoria looked at the camera. She didn't reach for a prepared answer, and Caleb could see, even on a video call, even in the compressed frame of a conference room screen, that she was choosing not to. She could have framed it. She could have managed it. She had been doing both those things for 23 years with the fluency of someone who had built an entire professional identity around the ability to control a narrative. She didn't. You're right, she said. I dismissed him publicly, in front of the client and my entire executive team, because his seniority didn't match the setting, and I was more concerned with how the room looked than what he was telling me. That was wrong. It was a leadership failure, and it contributed directly to the collapse. She paused. I can't prove the culture has changed. I can show you the structural reforms, the documentation, the regulatory cooperation, but the honest answer to your question is that you're going to have to watch it change over time, and the only thing I can offer you today is that I'm sitting in this meeting, not running it, because the person who understands this partnership best isn't me. And I know that now. Sandra Lim was quiet for a moment, wrote something, looked back at the screen. Thank you for that. The meeting went on for another 53 minutes. At the end of it, Fitch said they would take the framework to a full board vote within 10 days. He said it without promising an outcome, which was the honest version, and which Caleb respected. After the call ended, Victoria sat in the quiet of the conference room for a moment without moving. Caleb was closing his laptop. Neither of them said anything for a little while. Sandra Lim's question, Victoria said. I almost answered it differently. I know, Caleb said. I could see you deciding not to. She looked at him. Was that the right call? Yeah, he said. It was. She nodded, looked at the table. I've been running on a version of this where control equals competence for so long that I stopped being able to tell the difference between the two. She wasn't asking him to respond. She was thinking out loud in the manner of someone who doesn't usually do that in front of other people. Cross was able to do what he did for 6 years partly because I valued a certain kind of confidence. I confused it with substance. Caleb closed the laptop. He was very good at looking like substance. You didn't think so? I had less reason to, Caleb said. He took things from me. I noticed, even if I didn't know the scale of it. He paused. And I've always been more interested in the work than in who gets credit, which means I was paying attention to the work. You were paying attention to outcomes. Those aren't the same view. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. Something working in her face that was genuinely complicated. Not manufactured, not performed, just the actual texture of a person revising a long-held understanding of themselves. I owe you more than an apology, she said. I know that. What I need, Caleb said, is for the 43 people on the implementation team to have jobs in 6 months. She held his gaze. That's what you need. That's what I need. All right, she said. Then that's what we're working toward. Fitch's board voted on day 9 of the 10. The result was not unanimous. 2 members voted against, citing what they called residual governance risk, which was a fair concern and not one Caleb disagreed with. The remaining majority approved moving forward with a modified version of the framework, with one addition that Fitch himself proposed: a 6-month review clause at the end of Phase 1, jointly conducted, with both parties' boards present. Caleb read the approval notice at his desk on 14 and sat with it for a moment. Not triumphant, it wasn't that kind of feeling. More like the specific relief of watching something that was broken get to the point where fixing it is possible. The broken part doesn't stop being broken because fixing is now possible. But it's different. It's a different kind of problem. He forwarded the notice to Victoria with no comment. She replied in 3 minutes. "Thank you. I mean that completely." He typed back, "Let's build something that actually holds." The revised contract framework required 6 weeks of joint drafting, Caleb working on Sterling's side, with a small team he assembled from the compliance and risk departments, alongside Ardent's legal and operations teams. Every session was logged. Every version of every document was preserved in the shared system. Every benchmark was negotiated openly, with both teams in the room or on the call at the same time. It was slow. There were sessions that ended without resolution and had to be resumed. There were 3 points of genuine disagreement that required Fitch and Victoria to get on a call together and make decisions that neither team had been able to make without them. One of those calls lasted 2 hours and ended with a compromise that neither side thought was perfect, which Caleb considered to be a reasonable indicator that it was probably right. During the drafting weeks, Caleb established a rhythm that was new to him. He was working more visible now, not in the executive suite, not with a title that had changed, but in a role that was understood, if not yet formally named, as something beyond senior analyst. Victoria had asked him, in the 3rd week, whether he wanted to move to a different floor. "No," he said. She had looked at him the way she often did now, with an attention that was different from the way she'd looked at him in that ceremony room, more actual, less managed. "The 14th floor," she said. "You've been there 4 years." "The work is the same wherever I sit," he said. "I'd rather stay where I can hear what's actually happening." She didn't push it. She was learning, imperfectly, and with occasional backsliding, not to push things that weren't hers to push. This was not a comfortable process for her, and she did not pretend it was. There were days when Caleb could see the old habit moving under the surface, the reach for control, the instinct to centralize. And most days she caught it herself before it landed. Some days she didn't, and there would be a conversation, usually short, usually private, and the next day she'd be recalibrated. It wasn't a transformation. It was an adjustment, ongoing, the way most real change actually works. The third-party oversight body, the independent compliance auditor that the framework required, took 4 weeks to select. The process was jointly managed, with both Sterling and Ardent having veto rights. The firm they chose was small, specialized, and had a reputation in the industry for the particular unglamorous virtue of not being easily impressed. Their lead partner, a methodical woman named Dr. Irene Cho, met with Caleb twice before agreeing to take the engagement, and her questions in those meetings were the most specific and uncomfortable he'd faced outside the regulatory context. "Why did it take a public failure to surface what was happening?" she asked in the second meeting. Caleb didn't hedge. "Because the system rewarded the appearance of success over the substance of it, for long enough that the people who understood the substance stopped expecting to be heard." Dr. Cho looked at him over her glasses. "And you stayed anyway." "I had reasons to stay." "Tell me one." He thought about Dylan at the kitchen table, asking if they were okay. "Personal," he said, "but solid." She nodded slowly. "All right," she said. "We'll take the engagement." On the last Friday of the 6th week of drafting, the revised framework was complete. Not signed, that would come later, with ceremony that Caleb was already, privately, dreading, but complete. Whole. A document that said what it meant and meant what it said, with no trapdoors, no buried benchmarks, no 7th revision surprises. Caleb printed a copy and read it straight through, the whole thing, the way he had read the original contract 11 days into a process that nobody else had looked at carefully enough. He made one correction, a single word in a performance definition clause that wasn't wrong but was imprecise, and sent the final version to both teams. Then he closed his files, put on his jacket, and went downstairs. Dylan had soccer practice on Fridays. Caleb was always on time for soccer practice, or close enough that the difference wasn't worth arguing about. He drove across town with the window down slightly because the weather had shifted while he'd been inside for 6 weeks, and it was turning into the kind of evening that reminded you seasons change whether you notice them or not. He parked at the edge of the field and watched Dylan run. Not gracefully, because Dylan was 9 and grace was a later development, but with the full commitment of a kid who hadn't yet learned to hold anything back. He ran with his whole body, the way kids run when they still believe that trying hard is the point. Caleb leaned against the car and watched and let the last 6 weeks sit in him, the way things sit when they're done but not finished, when you've brought something to a place it couldn't get to before, and there's more road still ahead. There was more road still ahead. He knew it. The regulatory investigation would take months. The partnership agreement still needed to be signed. The 43 people on the implementation team were still technically in limbo, even if the limbo now had a visible end. Sterling Dynamics was not fixed. It was being fixed, which was a different thing, an ongoing thing, a thing that required continued attention and would produce more friction and more imperfect compromises and more late evenings at kitchen tables. But the document was whole, and the contract said what it meant. And the person who had been most careful about the work was no longer in a back corner of the room with his hand up, hoping someone would look. Dylan scored in scrimmage, a lucky shot, deflected in off another kid's shin, but the rule in soccer is that it counts if it goes in, and Dylan threw his arms up like it was the greatest thing that had ever happened, and the kids around him laughed, and Caleb found himself smiling without deciding to. His phone buzzed. Victoria. Dr. Cho confirmed engagement in writing. Also, Fitch wants to schedule the signing ceremony for the 14th. He asked if you'd be present. Caleb typed back, "I'll be there." A pause. Then Victoria again. He specifically said he wants you there. Not me. You. Caleb looked at that. Then at Dylan, still celebrating his deflected goal with the unself-conscious joy of someone who doesn't know yet that joy is supposed to be proportionate. "Tell him," Caleb typed. "I wouldn't miss it." He put his phone in his pocket. The practice went on. The evening light came down long and flat across the field, the way it does in the middle weeks of a season that's changing, and Caleb Rowan stood at the edge of it and let it be exactly what it was. The signing was scheduled for 2 o'clock on the 14th, in a room that was not the 38th floor. Victoria had suggested it, which surprised Caleb when Petra relayed the message. The 38th floor was Sterling Dynamics' ceremonial space, the room with the floor-to-ceiling glass and the skyline view, and the catering staff, and the branded displays. It was where you took clients when you wanted them to feel the weight of the company, when you wanted the setting to do some of the persuading. For 23 years, every major signing had happened there. Victoria wanted the 9th floor, the conference room with the practical table and the average lighting and no view worth mentioning, the room where the real work of the last 6 weeks had actually happened. Caleb told Petra to confirm the room without asking why, because he understood why. He arrived at 1:40, which was early, and found Gerald Fitch already there, standing at the window with a coffee from the lobby cart, looking out at the parking structure with the same watchful stillness he'd had in the ceremony room a month and a half ago. The difference was that this time when Fitch looked at Caleb, there was no measuring in it. Whatever measuring had needed to happen between them had already happened, in phone calls and documents, and 93 minutes on a video call, and the accumulated weight of 6 weeks of careful work. "You look tired," Fitch said. "I am tired," Caleb said. "Good tired or bad tired?" Caleb set his bag on the table. "The kind where you've been carrying something heavy, and you can see where you're going to put it down." Fitch nodded, drank his coffee. "My board almost didn't vote yes," he said. "I want you to know that. Sandra Lim brought it back from the edge. What changed her?" Victoria's answer to her question, on the call. Fitch looked at the parking structure. Sandra has a thing about people who apologize versus people who understand. She said Victoria understood, that it was different from an apology. He paused. She was right. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "How many deals have you walked away from?" 3. In 20 years. Fitch turned from the window. All 3. The company was presenting one thing and operating another. The gap between the presentation and the operation. That's where the damage always lives. He looked at Caleb directly. "You were the operation. Cross was the presentation. The gap between you was 6 years wide. The door opened and Victoria came in with Claire Ashworth and Dr. Irene Cho and 2 members of Ardent's legal team, followed by Sandra Lim and 2 other Ardent board representatives, and then, which Caleb had not expected, Marcus Webb, standing in the doorway looking like a man who wasn't sure whether he belonged in the room, but had come anyway, which Caleb thought was probably the most honest thing Marcus had done in 4 years. The room filled. People sat. Coffee was poured from a carafe that someone had brought up from 14, not catering. Caleb recognized it as the communal pot from his floor, which had been a deliberate choice by someone, and he suspected that someone was Petra. The bad coffee from 14. In the room where the real work happened, he almost said something about it and then didn't, because some things are better left as what they are. Victoria opened the meeting, not with remarks, just with the contract, printed and placed in front of each party, and a simple statement. We're here to sign this. Before we do, I'd like to say something, not remarks. Just something that needs to be said in a room with witnesses. She looked around the table. At Fitch, at Sandra Lim, at Claire Ashworth, at Dr. Cho, at Marcus Webb, standing near the door. At Caleb. A year ago, she said, I stood in the room upstairs and dismissed the one person who understood what was wrong with an agreement that was about to cost this company $480 million. I did it publicly, and I did it without hesitation, and I did it because I had spent 23 years building a version of leadership that was really just a version of certainty. And certainty felt like competence, and competence felt like control. She stopped. None of those things are the same. I know that now. I knew it in pieces before, but I know it completely now. And the difference between knowing something in pieces and knowing it completely is usually the thing you lost in between. She looked at the contract on the table. This agreement exists because of work done by people who were never given adequate credit. That is going to change. Structurally, formally, on the record. But I wanted to say it here first, in this room, before we sign anything. The room was quiet for a moment. Not the performed quiet of a ceremony, the actual quiet of people absorbing something real. Sandra Lim said, "Thank you, Ms. Sterling." 2 words, but the weight in them was specific and genuine, the weight of someone who had been waiting to see whether the understanding Victoria had shown on the call was real or situational. It was real. The room could feel that it was real. They signed the contract. The regulatory investigation concluded its primary findings 4 months later, on a Wednesday morning in late autumn, when the trees outside Sterling's building had gone the specific color of things letting go. Caleb was at his desk when the summary came through. He read it twice, which was his habit with documents that mattered, once for the content and once for the gaps, the places where the language compressed something complicated into something manageable, and you had to read what wasn't said as carefully as what was. The findings were comprehensive. Damian Cross had been formally charged with securities fraud, intellectual property misappropriation, and breach of fiduciary duty. The charges were specific and documented, built on the foundation of what Caleb had assembled and what the regulatory forensic team had expanded over the months of their investigation. The Hargrove Capital Partners connection had been fully unraveled. Cross's role was not advisor in the technical sense, but something closer to architect. The fund had been structured around his inside knowledge of Sterling's operations, its vulnerabilities, and the timing of deals he had positioned to fail. Howard Mercer's involvement was characterized in the findings as knowing participation, a phrase that was legally careful but communicated clearly enough. He had not engineered the scheme. He had known about it, benefited from it, and used his position as board chairman to smooth the path of the investigation away from the right questions at the right times. His resignation had been preemptive. The regulatory findings were going to follow him regardless. 3 other individuals within Sterling's organizational structure were identified as having had knowledge or partial knowledge of elements of the scheme, not architects, not principals, but people who had seen things and said nothing, which the findings treated as what it was, a different kind of failure, smaller in scale and larger in frequency than the ones that made headlines. Caleb sat with all of that for a while. The accountability was real, the documentation was solid, the findings would hold. And still he sat with the particular feeling that comes not from justice, but from the aftermath of justice. The strange flatness of having worked towards something for a long time and arrived at it and discovered that arrival doesn't feel the way pursuit does. Pursuit has direction. Arrival has to become something else, and the something else takes a moment to locate. He picked up his phone and called his sister Rachel. "It's done," he said when she answered. "The investigation findings came out." Rachel was quiet for a moment. She was 3 years older than Caleb and had the specific quality of people who have watched someone they love carry something difficult for a long time. The ability to be quiet in a way that is present rather than absent. "How do you feel?" she asked. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "That's fair." A pause. "Are you okay?" "Yeah." He looked out the window, the parking garage, the familiar gray of it. "I think I need a couple of days to figure out what okay looks like from here." "Dylan's got a game Saturday," she said. "Come for dinner Sunday. I'll make the thing you like." "The pasta thing?" "Yes, the pasta thing." "Okay," he said. "Yeah, Sunday." He hung up and sat at his desk and let the quiet of 14 settle around him the way it always did in the mid-morning, when most people were in meetings, and the floor had the specific productive stillness of a place where work was actually happening. He had been sitting at this desk for 4 years. The view hadn't changed, the coffee hadn't improved, the monitors were still decent. He had been offered, 3 times in the last month, a different desk on a different floor with a different title and a different coffee situation. He had said no each time, for the same reason he'd given Victoria when she'd first asked. The work was the same wherever he sat, and he'd rather be where he could hear what was actually happening. The 3rd time she'd asked, she had looked at him with a combination of frustration and something that was starting to resemble respect in its cleaner form, not the respect that comes from authority recognizing competence, but the respect that comes from one person genuinely understanding another. "You're going to make me keep coming to 14, she'd said. "The elevator works," he'd said. She'd gone back upstairs. But she'd come to 14 twice since then, which was more than she'd come in the previous 4 years combined, and each time she'd sat in the practical chair across from his practical desk and talked about the work with a specificity that was different from how she'd talked in the months before the collapse. Less overview, more detail, as if she'd developed an appetite for the texture of things rather than just their outcomes. It wasn't a perfect working relationship. There were still moments when the old Victoria moved under the surface, the reflex toward control, the instinct to compress complexity into a clean narrative. There were still meetings where Caleb watched her start to dismiss something and then catch herself, which was better than not catching herself, but was still a catch, still a moment where the default was wrong and had to be corrected. He didn't expect that to stop. He had stopped expecting people to stop being who they were. The question was whether they could become more of who they were trying to be, slowly, imperfectly, in the actual direction of something better. He thought she was. Imperfectly, with backsliding, in the actual direction of something better. He pulled up his current file and got back to work. The year's end review happened in December, in a format that was new to Sterling Dynamics and had been proposed by Dr. Irene Cho as part of the independent oversight structure, a full accountability session, open to all staff above a certain level, where leadership presented the year's performance against the commitments made at the start of it. Not a town hall, not a celebration, a reckoning conducted in public, with the results visible to everyone who had a stake in them. Caleb had not been asked to present. He was in the room as a member of the Oversight Observation Team, a role Dr. Cho had established for the specific purpose of having people present who would notice what the presentation got wrong or compressed or omitted. He sat at the back, which was, he reflected, where he had been when this whole thing started. The room was a company-wide meeting space on the 12th floor, large enough for 200 people, and it was full. The implementation team was there, all 43 of them, or what was now 47 of them, because the ardent Phase 1 activation had required additional staffing and all of it had been filled internally. Marcus Webb was there, looking like a man who had spent several months deciding what kind of person he wanted to be and had arrived at a tentative answer. Rob Ewan from IT Security was there, in the back row, with the expression of a person who had been in the middle of something important and was still processing the experience of that. Petra was there, near the front, with her legal pad. Victoria presented for 40 minutes. The financial data, the regulatory resolution, the partnership status, the structural governance reforms, the oversight framework, the staff retention numbers. She presented it plainly, without the rhetorical architecture that press releases used, the specific plainness of someone who had decided that the facts, stated clearly, were more trustworthy than any frame you put around them. At the 30-minute mark, she said something that Caleb had not been told she was going to say. "I want to address something that isn't in the financial data," she said. Sterling Dynamics, for a significant period of its recent history, operated in a way that extracted value from certain people while crediting that value to others. That's a factual statement, not a characterization. The regulatory findings document it in specific detail. The intellectual property that shaped several of this company's most significant analytical frameworks came from one analyst on the 14th floor, and for 6 years that work was published under someone else's name and used to build someone else's reputation. She paused. "The analyst's name is Caleb Rowan. He's in this room. He tried to warn us before the Ardent collapse, and I told him to leave. I want that on the record too, because accountability that stops at the structural level and doesn't name the specific human failure isn't complete." The room went still. 200 people, and the particular silence of people who are paying full attention and not moving. "What I did that morning was wrong," Victoria said. "It was wrong in the immediate way. I dismissed a correct warning in front of 60 people. And it was wrong in the larger way, which is that it was the logical endpoint of a culture I had built, where the appearance of confidence outranked the substance of analysis. Caleb's work helped save this company. The least I can do is say his name." Caleb sat at the back of the room and looked at the table surface in front of him and felt the particular experience of being named in a room full of people when you have spent your entire professional life arranging not to be. It was uncomfortable. It was not the kind of uncomfortable that needed to be fixed. He let it sit. Afterward, people found him. Not all at once, in the kind of gradual way that happens when individuals who have been thinking something finally have an occasion to say it. A woman from the compliance team who had been at Sterling for 8 years and said, quietly, that she had flagged things before and been told she was missing the big picture, and that it was good to know there was a record now. A younger analyst from the risk team who asked, with the directness of someone who had not yet learned to soften professional questions, whether Caleb would be willing to review the team's current methodology framework and tell them what was wrong with it. "What makes you think something's wrong with it?" Caleb asked. "Because everything has something wrong with it," the analyst said. "I'd rather know what it is than find out later." Caleb looked at him for a moment. 26, maybe 27, with the specific alertness of someone who'd entered the field with genuine rather than performed interest. "Send it to me," he said. "I'll read it this week." Marcus Webb found him near the door as people were leaving. He stood for a moment without saying anything, which was its own kind of statement. "I should have listened to you," Marcus said finally. "The morning of the signing. Before that, when you first raised it. I had 2 escalations from you, and I treated them like administrative noise." "You were operating inside a system that rewarded that," Caleb said. "Not as an excuse, as a fact. That doesn't—" Marcus stopped. Tried again. "I'm trying to apologize, not explain." Caleb looked at him. Marcus Webb was not a bad person. He had never thought that. He was a person who had chosen convenience so many times that convenience had become his default, and defaults are harder to override than decisions because they don't feel like choices. "I know," he said. "I hear you." Marcus nodded. "Okay." He started to leave, then turned back. "For what it's worth, I read the framework document, the one you built for the Ardent renegotiation. It's—" He paused, choosing. "It's the best piece of risk architecture I've ever seen produced internally. I don't know how you do it." "Carefully," Caleb said. And slowly. Marcus almost smiled. He left. The first Phase 1 review under the Ardent partnership happened in late February, 14 months after the original collapse. Caleb presented the results alongside Dr. Cho and 2 members of Ardent's operations team in a format that was joint. Not Sterling presenting to Ardent or Ardent presenting to Sterling, but both teams presenting together, which had been one of the specific structural innovations of the revised framework, and which, in practice, was more awkward and more productive than anyone had anticipated. The Phase 1 benchmarks had been met in full. Not easily. There had been a 3-week period in October when a platform integration issue had put 2 of the benchmarks at risk, and the joint response to that problem had been the first real test of whether the oversight structure worked. It had worked, imperfectly, with friction, in the way that functional structures work when they're actually being used rather than just maintained. Dr. Cho had flagged the issue on day 4. Both teams had been in a call together on day 6. The integration fix had taken 9 days and required a timeline adjustment that both boards approved. After the review session, Sandra Lim found Caleb in the hallway. "Phase 2, she said without preamble. "Our board is ready to activate if yours is." "I'll confirm with Victoria today," Caleb said. Lim nodded. She had the quality, he'd noticed it over the months of their working relationship, of a person who said exactly what she meant and nothing additional, which created a communicational efficiency that Caleb appreciated deeply. "The oversight structure is working," she said. "I want you to know Ardent is committed to it continuing." "So is Sterling," Caleb said. She looked at him for a moment with the specific expression of someone deciding whether to say the thing they came to say. She decided yes. "When Fitch told me about the original signing, about what happened to you in that room, I thought it was the kind of story that ends with the person leaving the company. Going somewhere they'd be treated better." "I thought about it," Caleb said honestly. "What made you stay?" He thought about it, not the practical reasons, the stability, the familiarity, the school pickup at 3:15 that only worked because his commute was 12 minutes. The actual reason, the one underneath the practical ones. "Because leaving would have been easier than staying and being right," he said. "And I think, looking back, that I stayed partly because some part of me knew the record would matter eventually, that it wouldn't stay buried." Lim looked at him. "That's a long bet." "Yes," he said. "It was." She nodded once, the way she nodded when something confirmed rather than surprised. "Phase 2, she said, and walked back into the meeting room. Spring came to the city the way it usually did, not all at once but in installments, a warm day followed by a cold one, the trees making tentative gestures and then reconsidering, the light changing gradually until one morning you looked outside and the quality of it was different, and you understood that something had shifted while you weren't watching. Dylan turned 10 in April, and the birthday involved a soccer game and then a dinner with Rachel and her family and too much cake, which Dylan ate with the focused commitment he brought to everything he did, and which Caleb watched with the feeling he'd been accumulating all year, the feeling of a person who has been through something significant and come out the other side of it into something that isn't resolution exactly, because resolution implies a cleanness that life doesn't usually provide, but is instead a kind of established footing. Solid ground, the kind you can build on. After the dinner, after Dylan was in bed and the apartment was quiet, Caleb sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd organized the encrypted folder, where he'd called Gerald Fitch, where he'd listened to Victoria's voice on the phone and heard something in it that made him decide to trust her enough to share what he'd found. And he opened his laptop, not to work, but to look at something he'd saved months ago and hadn't gone back to. It was the history worksheet, Dylan's worksheet, from the night after the Ardent collapse, with the question about what happens when people in power fail to listen to the people around them. Bad things happen that could have been avoided. He looked at that for a while. Then he closed the laptop and sat in the quiet kitchen and thought about what the year had been. Not the events of it, the sequence of events, but what it had actually been in terms of what it asked of him and what it cost and what it returned. It had asked him to be patient in a room that didn't value patience. To be precise in a culture that preferred the appearance of precision over the thing itself. To carry 6 years of work without attribution and keep doing the work anyway, not because he was unusually virtuous, but because the alternative was to become someone who stopped caring about whether the work was right, and he couldn't do that. He tried to figure out, in the years before this one, whether that was a character strength or a character flaw, and he had mostly concluded it was neither. It was just the way he was built. The same way some people are built for speed and others for endurance, and the difference is only useful or not depending on what the terrain requires. This terrain had required endurance. What it cost was something he was still accounting for. 6 years was a long time to work without being seen. There was a version of him that was angrier about that than the version sitting at the kitchen table in April, a year after the collapse. But the anger had never been the loudest thing in him, had been present but not primary. And what had replaced it over the months was something less dramatic and more durable. Not satisfaction exactly, something closer to the feeling of knowing you did the thing you were supposed to do, in the circumstances you were given, and it held. What it returned was harder to name. The partnership was real and functioning. The 47 people on the implementation team had jobs that were stable. The governance structure at Sterling was better than it had been, which was not the same as good but was better than it had been. And better than it had been was the most honest description of most improved things. Victoria was leading differently, still imperfectly, still with the occasional reach for the old reflexes, but differently, in ways that were visible to people who worked close to it. The work itself, the risk architecture, the framework documents, the methodology he'd spent years building in obscurity, was now attributed, formally, with his name on it, in the company's knowledge base and in the revised industry publications that the journals had issued after the cross-examination of the submission records. His name was on it. That was new. He was still adjusting to it, the specific strangeness of being visible after years of deliberate invisibility. Caleb Rowan, Senior Strategic Analyst and Ethics Oversight Lead, a title that had been created for him 3 months ago by a process that involved Victoria, Dr. Cho, Claire Ashworth, and a 2-hour conversation about what the role actually was and what it needed to be called. The title was long and slightly awkward, which Caleb had noted and Victoria had said was appropriate given that the role itself was new, and they didn't yet have a clean shorthand for it. He still sat on 14. The Phase 2 activation ceremony happened in June, in the 9th floor conference room, with the communal coffee pot from 14 and no catering and no branded displays. Gerald Fitch and Sandra Lim were there. Dr. Cho was there. Victoria, Caleb, the implementation team leads, Claire Ashworth. 43, now 47, people whose professional futures had been suspended in the wreckage of one bad morning a year and a half ago, and who were now here because the wreckage had been sorted through, and what could be salvaged had been salvaged, and what needed to be built new had been built new. The ceremony took 12 minutes, which was probably a record for a $720 million partnership activation, and which Caleb considered an achievement in itself. After the signing, as people were gathering their things and the room was filling with the particular warm noise of professionals who are genuinely relieved, Victoria came to where Caleb was standing near the window, the parking garage view, the view he'd stared at for 4 years, and stood beside him. She didn't say anything immediately. Neither did he. They stood in the way two people stand when they have been through something long and complicated together and have arrived somewhere and don't yet need to fill the arrival with words. After a moment, Victoria said, "I've been thinking about what I said in the review, about the system I built." "Okay," Caleb said. "I keep coming back to the moment in the ceremony room, that morning, when you had your hand up." She looked at the window. "I knew something was off. I want to be honest. There was a part of me that registered that something was off, that you wouldn't be standing there with your hand up if it wasn't real." Caleb looked at the parking garage. "And I dismissed it anyway," she said, "because the room was set up for a signing and you were in the wrong part of the room and your title wasn't the right title and the moment wasn't the right moment." She paused. "I've spent a lot of time since then thinking about all the moments like that, all the rooms where something was real, and I looked at the frame instead of what was inside it." "What do you do with that?" Caleb asked. Not rhetorical. He was actually asking. "I try to be slower," she said. "I try to actually look before I've already decided what I'm looking at." She was quiet for a moment. "It's harder than it sounds." "I know," he said. "You make it look easy." "I don't," he said. "I just do it slowly and in writing, so by the time I'm looking at something, I've already spent 11 days with it. That's not ease. That's process." She looked at him sideways. "Is that what you were doing? 11 days before the signing?" "Yes." And you told me to leave," he said. "Yes." The words were not accusatory. They were just the accurate description of what had happened, said plainly between two people who had both spent a year living with the consequence of that moment and who were now standing on the other side of it with something that was not closure, because that morning was part of the record and the record didn't close, but was instead the kind of honest reckoning that lets you move forward without pretending the past was different than it was. Victoria nodded slowly. She looked out the window for another moment. Then she said quietly, "Thank you for staying." Caleb thought about that. About all the versions of not staying, the letters he hadn't written, the exits he hadn't taken, the specific stubbornness that had kept him in the chair on 14 through 6 years of being overlooked, and one very public dismissal and the long, complicated year that followed. "I had a 9-year-old, he said. Stability mattered." She looked at him. He looked back. They both understood that this was true, and also not the whole truth, and they left it there, in the space between the true thing and the fuller thing, where most honest conversations about complex situations actually live. In the room behind them, Fitch was laughing at something Sandra Lim had said. The implementation team leads were taking a photograph with someone's phone. Crowded into the frame together, one of them making a face, someone's arm at the wrong angle. Dr. Cho was talking to Claire Ashworth about something, both of them with the focused, quick quality of people who have worked well together and are already thinking about the next thing. The communal coffee pot from 14 was empty. Caleb picked up his bag. He had a 3:15 pickup, and it was 2:47. "I have to go," he said. Victoria looked at the time. "The pickup?" "Yes." She nodded. Something in her face that was straightforward and real. The look of a person who has come to understand something about what matters to someone else and now holds that understanding without needing to do anything with it. "Go," she said. He went. The drive took 11 minutes, which was one less than usual because he caught the light on Merker Street, and he pulled up to the school at 3:13, which was 2 minutes early, which Dylan would not acknowledge because for Dylan, on time was invisible and early was merely what should always have been the case. Dylan came out with his backpack on both shoulders and his jacket fully zipped, which meant the weather had actually been considered, which was new, which Caleb decided to not comment on in case acknowledging it caused it to stop happening. He got in the car and looked at his father. "How was it?" Dylan asked. "Good," Caleb said. "The signing thing?" "Yes." "So it's done?" Caleb pulled out of the school lot and onto the street. The afternoon light was the particular gold of early summer in the late afternoon, the kind of light that makes everything look slightly more significant than it is, or possibly exactly as significant as it is, and you're just paying attention. "Phase 2 is active," he said, which means there's still Phase 3. Dylan considered this. "So not actually done." "Not actually done. But the hard part is—" He paused, thought about whether that was true, decided it was, in the way that most things that are true, provisionally, with caveats, in the specific context in which they're said. The hard part is done. Dylan looked out the window at the passing street. He had the quality, sometimes, of a kid who was thinking something through and would get there in his own time, and the thing you could do was wait. Caleb waited. "Dad," Dylan said. "Yeah." "At my game last Saturday. That woman from your work, the CEO." Caleb glanced at him. "Victoria?" "She came to my game." Caleb was quiet for a moment. He had not known this. "She did?" "She was at the back. She left before it ended." Dylan paused. "She didn't talk to me or anything. I just saw her. She looked like she was watching." Caleb drove. He thought about that. Victoria Sterling at the back of a youth soccer field on a Saturday, watching a 10-year-old play, not talking to anyone, leaving before it ended. The privacy of it. The specific gesture of a person who understood, finally, what they owed and what they couldn't repay and what they could do anyway. "Did you ask her about it?" Dylan said. "Not yet," Caleb said. "Are you going to?" He thought about the parking garage window and the room behind them, and thank you for staying, and the way she'd said go when he'd said he had to leave. "No," he said. "I think I'll let it be what it was." Dylan seemed to accept this, the way he accepted things that had the quality of being finished with, not resolved in the neat sense, but arrived at. The conversation over not because it was avoided, but because it had gone where it needed to go. They drove home through the gold afternoon light, past the school and the park, and the corner store where Dylan sometimes spent his allowance on things Caleb only partially approved of, past the diner on Hollis Street, where the light was always on and the coffee was always hot, and people sat in the window booths at all hours looking like they were working something out. At the red light on 7th, Dylan said, "Pizza again Friday?" "Probably," Caleb said. "Pepperoni?" "Obviously." The light changed. They drove on into the evening, into the ordinary, irreplaceable texture of a day that had been significant and was now becoming the kind of day that doesn't stay significant in the retelling but lives in the body of the person who was in it, in the specific weight of a bag set down, in a 12-minute drive that felt like arrival, in a kid asking about pizza and a father saying obviously, and the city moving past the windows in the gold light of a day that was ending. The way good days end. Not with resolution, but with continuation, The quiet, reliable continuation of people who have come through something and are still here, still going, still putting one foot in front of the other in the direction of the life they are trying to make. Caleb Rowan drove his son home. That was enough. For today, that was completely enough.